Hello and welcome to the Royals Investment Fund podcast, where we meet with professors, experts, and professionals in the business and investing world. We are here to bring you insight into these success stories of individuals through their careers, investment choices, and recommendations. This podcast was specifically designed to help business students as they start their journey into the business world. I'm your host, Tony Harris. Now let's get started. Before we dive into our first podcast, I do want to give a fair warning. Due to COVID-19, we do not have our podcast studio or the proper equipment. So you might hear dogs barking in the background, and you also might not get the best audio quality. For that, we apologize, but hopefully in the near future, we will be able to get back into the studio. Thank you. Today, I would like to welcome someone that has over 30 years of professional investment experience. She started her career attending Yale, where she got her degree in economics. Not to mention, she also won a national championship in D1 squash. From there, she started in the investing world at only 22 years old, working for Merrill Lynch on Wall Street. After her time at Merrill Lynch, she went on to get her MBA in finance from Wharton School of Business. Once she received her MBA, she became a vice president in derivative sales trading at JP Morgan on Wall Street. After her time on Wall Street, she spent 10 years as a senior consultant at Global Markets Consultants. From there, she went to work at the Clifton Group in Minneapolis, where she spent 9 years as a project manager and 1 year as a portfolio manager. After working for 30 years in the investment world, she decided to take a major career change. She went on to become a professor of economics and finance at Bethel University. I'm excited to introduce a professor who genuinely cares for her students' education, personal lives, and decision-making skills. I would like to introduce Professor Amanda Carter.
So, Professor Carter, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
I'm happy to do it.
So, real quick, just tell me, what led you to Bethel University to be a professor?
Well, a couple of different things. I had many friends tell me about the opening because they knew that I was a Christian. And they also knew that I was ready for a change in my current job. I had been working at Parametric Portfolio Associates, and I'd just been leading a trading desk. We were mostly trading futures for institutional clients. And that job, I loved it, and I loved the firm, but it had sort of become my whole life. My kids had left the house to go to school and on to their careers. My husband was working hard, and I felt it just wasn't healthy the way the job was becoming my whole life and my God. Earlier in my career, I'd spent a lot of time educating internally, both at JP Morgan when derivatives were fairly new, and then also in a consulting position when I needed a flexible job. So I knew that I liked teaching, I knew that I liked explaining financial concepts, and I knew that I wanted to be in a place where I could integrate faith into my work.
That is awesome. So I just have a quote here from your advisor at Yale. He said, you either need to go to Wall Street because you're very quantitative and you just have intuition about numbers, or you should get a PhD and teach. And I mean, now you've done both. Does that feel like a big accomplishment to you?
Well, full disclosure, I don't have a PhD, which part of me regrets. He encouraged me to choose one of those two paths because he was very supportive of my academic interests, and he felt that I had the intellectual ability to go to Wall Street or to, pursue that ultimate degree. Because of student loans, to be perfectly honest, and because there are very few fully funded economics PhD programs, I decided to go to Wall Street. I went to Merrill Lynch and worked in investment banking on the corporate finance side for 2 years, and then did go get my MBA. So I'm very grateful for his guidance. He unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago, but he is a giant in the field. He's the founder of the arbitrage pricing theory, which is basically the number 2 equity pricing model behind the capital asset pricing model. So I was blessed to have him as my advisor, and I was blessed that he told me to take a lot of math. I essentially did a math minor. It wasn't technically a math minor because that didn't exist at the time. But he gave me good guidance, great encouragement, and I have a feeling that his recommendation to my business school probably helped me.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that he was a mentor in your life to some extent?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He was a mentor, and I actually didn't meet him through my undergrad. I met him at a place I worked. I worked at sort of a family camp in New Hampshire. That's a lot like Grandview Lodge would be for a Minnesotan family. And I was like leading mountain climbs and teaching sailing and doing things like that before my sophomore year at undergrad. And I met him there, and I happened to have I was wearing a t-shirt that said Yale on it, and he started to talk to me. So I just thought he was like a regular faculty guy at Yale. Turns out he was honestly one of the top people in the field globally. And I very naively asked him to be my advisor. And he said yes. So later I found out that was probably completely inappropriate. There were, PhD students who he turned down right and left. But because of me being nice to his kids and helping his family in a totally unrelated situation and a friendship we had, he agreed to be my advisor, and it really was a huge influence. Back when I went to undergrad, you could do an econ. I was econ undergrad, which I'm very proud of. You could do an econ undergrad with not a lot of math. And that's a great degree. But for someone going to Wall Street or who later wants to teach or get a PhD, the math, the quant piece of the econ was important at that time. So he pushed me hard, and he also gave me a lot of support. So I'm very grateful for him, and I'm not sure where I'd be if not for his influence at that time, which is part of the reason I like teaching so much. Is you can really have a wonderful impact on a young person at a critical moment in their life.
So pertaining to Wall Street, you started working on Wall Street when you were 22 years old. I mean, for someone that's looking to get into derivatives trading, becoming a stockbroker, or even working on Wall Street, what are your suggestions for students that are trying to be as ambitious as you and trying to get that position?
Yeah, well, back I got out of undergrad in 1986, which is a long time ago. And back then, if you wanted to have a meaningful career in finance, you pretty much had to go to New York. Now, fortunately, there are really great jobs in finance in a lot of different places. Students at Bethel who want to stay in Minneapolis or go to Chicago will have opportunities to have really challenging careers with bright people working in all different types of products. But I pretty much had to go to Wall Street to do what I wanted to do. So what I would suggest for students is to study hard, learn the material to actually master the material, not to just, get a grade in a class. I would say do a double emphasis. I think finance is great paired with analytics, paired with marketing, paired with anything really, but do a double emphasis. It's very selective to get a job on Wall Street, so you're going to have to, get a good GPA, have a meaningful internship, and then, quite frankly, just be prepared to work a lot and to have a very thick skin. It's a brutal environment even now. When I tell people that I worked 80 hours a week, they don't believe me, because if you do the math in your head, that basically means you work and you sleep a little. And that's what you do. A lot of these programs are 2-year programs, and they hope that you go away to business school and then come back with an MBA. So 80 hours a week was a normal week, and it was a very competitive environment. Your peers are actually hoping you fail because they want your chair. It was a terrible place to be a woman. It would be a terrible place to be a person of color back in the 80s. It's much better now. But having a thick skin was important. What made up for all of that was the challenge, just the challenge, and then to be in an environment where everyone around you is brilliant, everyone around you is charging hard, and you're literally creating products that are new, and you're generating capital that's going to create growth in business and create jobs. So it was wonderful. I'm really glad I did it. It did sort of suck the life out of me, though.
Wow, that is crazy. Mm-hmm. Back to the Wall Street, kind of that wolf mentality. Like, were you faced with ethical decisions as, a Christian in a predominantly secular workplace? And how did you deal with that?
Well, it's interesting because I actually never had a business ethical decision where I felt compromised. I know some of those existed. For me, I didn't experience that personally, but I will say the culture challenged my faith, because everyone around me was God. God was not God. Money was God, not God. So the culture was all about making the most money in the fastest way. The culture was all about being number one, who had the highest grade in the training program, who made the most revenue in their chair, who went on the most roadshows with clients, who did the most M&A deals. I mean, you're just always benchmarking and quantifying in things that are of the world and superficial. And it is incredibly hard to keep your eyes focused on God in that environment. So I would say that for me, it wasn't that every day I had to make a difficult ethical choice. It was that it was very hard to stay close to God. And when you're working 80 hours a week in a normal week and 100 hours a week in a deal week, you don't make time for God. I didn't make time for God the way I should have. I put my work first. So I would say that was the challenge as a Christian. I would go to church once a week, and I was the only person I knew who did that. But being a Christian in a good relationship with God isn't about spending an hour at church every week. It's about being in communion with God every day. So I didn't do a good job with that.
So for you, what changed when you went to Wall Street and you worked there and the environment was hectic? Eventually you left and went to Santa Barbara, California. What was that like? What was the change for you? What drove that?
So I did two years in investment banking at Merrill Lynch, and then I did 2 years in grad school and got my MBA at the Wharton School in Philly. And then I spent 4 years at JP Morgan on the trading side, trading derivatives. And that was probably more like a 70-hour-a-week job, which sounds crazy to most people, but that was pretty good for Wall Street. And then after about 4 years there, I was married and pregnant with my first child, and my husband was getting out of the Army. He was full-time Army. So we reached a point where we had to decide, are we going to have one big job or two big jobs? And we together, he's also a Christian, together decided we didn't want to have a baby and two big jobs. And I felt like it was sort of his turn to have the big job because he was just getting out of the Army. Now, he had big jobs in the Army, but it was going to be his first big civilian job. So I enjoyed a year full-time at home with my first child. We moved twice cross-country for his job, so I feel like I was a professional relocation person for that year. But it was terrific. Every family decides what's right for them, and some families, it's both parents have big jobs. Some families, it's the mom has the big job, and some families, it's the dad has the big job. And there's no right answer. Like, I really believe every family chooses what's right for them. And for us, what was right when we ended up having a second child, was for me to be flexible and for him to have the big job. And if I was flexible, then he could work and travel. And the kids had one of their own two parents caring for them, which was the right thing for our little family of four. So during that time, I did want to work. I wanted to keep my foot in the door. I wanted to have an intellectual stimulation beyond the very hard work of being the primary caregiver at home. So I ended up consulting in executive education, and that was the Santa Barbara company. So for 10 years, the 10 years where my children were the littlest, I worked for a consulting company, and we went and we delivered training programs to investment banks. So I would go spend 5 days at JP Morgan and teach all their brand new MBA hires about derivatives. Or I would spend 3 days at Deutsche Bank and I would teach all their BA hires about financial math. So I went and delivered programs maybe 30 days a year. And the rest of the time I was working from home with a very flexible situation. So it worked beautifully for our family. And I also got my CFA certification during that time. So I didn't ever live in Santa Barbara, but I worked for a Santa Barbara company and I spent a fair amount of time out there. But it was a gift from God that I had 10 years where I could focus both on my family, but also progress in my career with my certification, keep a foot in the door, keep my 401k getting funded, all sorts of good things about work, without, sacrificing too much at home. So I loved that job. And that's the job where I really, in a very structured way, taught. I stood up in a room 8 hours a day and I taught. So I feel like that helped me, 15 years later, get the job at Bethel. So this is, clearly God's plan for me. And that's my dog in the background.
Yeah, I hear it. I love that. So regarding career path, if you were to go back, would you change anything about the way you did it?
I would not, because I really, truly believe God's path for me was the path that I went on. I think he knows everything, thousands of years before they happen. So I really believe every step in the path was part of what I needed. There were some, hard days, overwhelming days. It was terrible being a woman on Wall Street in the 80s. Like, it was a very hostile environment. I didn't feel safe a lot of the time. But I don't think I'd be where I am if not for the journey. I'm just very grateful for every opportunity I've had. I do, when my colleagues with their PhDs put on their fun PhD hats when they're in their regalia, I think, wow, I wish I had a PhD. I truly wish I had a PhD. But I'm not really a person who looks back with regret. And at this point, I don't have the energy to do it, to be honest. So I respect my peers who've gotten that ultimate degree, and a little bit of my pride suffers when I have to say I don't have a PhD. But I feel that I have a good, I've had great educational opportunities, and I think my work experience helps me teach in my emphasis. So I'm happy that I'm professionally qualified.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So for students kind of getting ready to get on their career paths, we're in a time right now that's very unprecedented. I mean, students coming out of Bethel, out of any school, are losing their full-time jobs because companies can't hold them, or their internships are folding because they it's not going to work in this time. What would you say to these students who are trying to figure it out right now?
Yeah. So the first few things I would say are going to just sound very trite and placating, and they are, but I'm very sincere when I say that this will all be fine. I was in my first year at Merrill Lynch when October of 1987 happened. I was at my futures trading company when 2008, 2009 happened. So I've been through two similar situations. I actually was downsized from Merrill Lynch. My whole class was in 1988, right before business school. So I'm very empathetic to the situation. But I do think that if students can be patient, the environment will be better. What happened in 2008 and what happened in 1987 were really bad markets because of bad fundamentals. This is a bad market because of an exogenous shock of a virus. So it's ridiculous to say this, but it's better now, I believe, than in 2008. We're in a moment of uncertainty now. We don't know if this is another bad month or another bad 2 years. I mean, the Spanish flu came back. It really wasn't done for 2-3 years. So we don't quite know what we're dealing with now. So that's fear. That's a time of fear. But I do believe that the market will come back when we get medication and hopefully eventually a vaccine for this. And there's actually news this morning about a company that has a medication that looks very promising. The market's up today. So I think we'll be back. I just don't know when. The other thing I would say that's going to sound trite, but it's very, very true, is that God is in control. He tells us not to worry. If he knows every, hair on our head, then certainly he knows what we're dealing with now. And he doesn't promise us, 6 job offers and a smooth life and a market going up 15% every year, but he does promise to be with us. And whenever we humans face challenges, we can either lean on him or we can, do the opposite. So I would just encourage students to be patient and to lean into God. This is a time when you have more time to spend with God, more time to spend with your family, etc. And then the third thing I would say is to be flexible. So, a year ago, every one of my finance grads had, like 5 great job offers. This will be different. Now, instead of maybe being a research analyst at a great firm, you might have to do compliance. You might have to do operations. You might have to work for a mid-sized firm. You might have to be, in a job that's a little less impressive than you would have if you graduated even a semester earlier. But use that opportunity. I mean, I think if you work in compliance or ops or for a small firm or maybe in a slightly different industry, as long as you're working and getting, you're learning, you're constantly pushing forward, then you'll look back on this time and you'll understand, what you got out of it. So I think a lot of it's attitude, a lot of it's patience, a lot of it's, just trusting God. All of these things are very hard to do. And we have to recognize we're all disappointed. We're all fearful. This stinks for seniors. This timing couldn't be worse for seniors. And a lot of my junior students have lost their internships or their internships have turned virtual. I mean, it's a very difficult situation. So we have to acknowledge that, but then I would encourage patience, flexibility, trusting God, and, it will get better. No one knows when, but it will get better.
Right now, do you look at the economy as an opportunity to invest? As you have been my investment professor. I know you're risk averse, but what do you have to say about the economy right now?
Yes, all of my students know that I'm risk averse and I don't like market timing. I believe in long-term fundamental analysis. It's a time to buy though, because price earnings multiples are low. Things are cheap. If you thought, company X was a good buy 2 months ago, it's a better buy today. So if you have enough cash to pay your bills going forward and you have a nice emergency fund and you have a little extra cash, it's probably a pretty good time to buy. But as I said earlier, we just don't know if this is a month, 3 months, or a year of this. And it's very volatile. So I would be cautious. I think cash is king now. I think everybody should have a little extra liquidity right now because we just don't know what's coming. But yes, it is absolutely true that it could be a buying opportunity if you had enough cash. But a lot of people bought when the market was down 10%, and then eventually it was down over 20%. It's down about 16% with today's gains overall. But yeah, there are pockets of opportunity for sure. And I'm okay with timing if the fundamentals are good. So just make sure the fundamentals are good.
As someone that's worked on Wall Street and in the finance career for over 30 years, what is your favorite form of personal investing and why?
So what my husband and I do, I'll talk in very broad terms, we actually believe mostly in efficient markets. So in a lot of segments, we are pretty passive. So like in US large cap, it's very hard to beat the market. That market is pretty efficient. So in large cap, we are pretty passive. We will buy index funds, ETFs, pay low fees. And then with, let's say, 20% of our portfolio, my husband likes to try and find value. So we've got a couple of venture capital things in our portfolio. Those are long-term, you either hit a home run or you strike out kind of things. And then in what I call neglected stocks, so some emerging markets, some small cap, in those spaces, we will try to pick stocks that will outperform their benchmark. So I think you can find alpha, you can find opportunities to outperform the market, you can find pockets of slight inefficiency here and there. But overall, I do believe the markets are pretty efficient. So for us, it's probably 80% passive index, happy to match the market, and the rest is a little bit more trying to be smarter than the market. Of course, we're a little bit older. My husband's even a little bit older than I am, so we're not 100% equity anymore. We're sort of working our way towards de-risking. So, I have bonds in there now that I didn't have a whole lot of before. But well diversified, risk appropriate, time horizon appropriate investments.
So now moving towards a student's perspective. So what would you suggest a Bethel University student should participate in, should learn about, should really seek out to make the most of their 4 years at Bethel?
Well, I think it's a very hard question because we're all so unique, right? And my lens is pretty narrow. I used to teach ManFin. I've taught business problem solving. So I see some other business students, but, probably 75% of my time is just with finance students or students who have a double emphasis with finance. So I'm not sure I have a good perspective on what's good for all Bethel students, but I would say for business students, I would try and get all the principles classes done early so you see what you like and what you're good at. I would strongly consider a double emphasis because I think that you'll enjoy it intellectually and it'll also just give you more flexibility later. As I've shared a few times, a lot of my finance marketing double emphases, they get really great jobs marketing at financial services companies. And I think that's a great avenue for a marketing student, for example. Some of the students who are finance and analytics doubles get really great jobs doing analysis work at banks, investment management companies, and corporations even within their finance groups. So I think a double is a great idea. And then I would be very open-minded to some of the opportunities at Bethel beyond the classroom. So, of course, the CFA Research Challenge, the Deloitte case for people who have accounting in their emphasis, the Student Managed Investment Fund, of course, which I'm an advisor for, and Bethel Biz Mentor Program. All of those extra things beyond the classroom they're really valuable. I hear from alums all the time who tell me that their mentor from Bethel Biz or someone they met at a Bethel Business and Economics Association event or their experience on the fund, for example, has been something that's distinguished them or opened a door for them. So we're all way too busy, so I don't think every student should sign up for everything they can. But I would say try and have a meaningful participation in one or two of the things that I've mentioned. Don't have an unmeaningful participation in all of them. Pick one or two of them and dig in and get a lot out of it. So I think that'll prepare students well. It'll also be interesting. Much more interesting than being laser focused and only one emphasis and only one other thing. So that would be my advice. And then I'm just a big math fan. So, take some math, man. It'll open doors. It'll make you different from everybody else if you're good at math. So that's awesome. Good.
What do you think sets people apart when they first enter their career? Mm-hmm. And how can they excel more than their peers around them?
All right. Well, some of you have heard this before because I talk about this. But I think one thing you can do is to be incredibly valuable to your boss. The way you're incredibly valuable to your boss is to do your work well and to make their job easier. So I think about the TAs I've had at Bethel who've really stuck out in my mind. They've sort of thought ahead. They've thought ahead about what happens next. They've anticipated what I need. They're very detail oriented, and they'll maybe catch something that I've done wrong in haste. So make your boss's job easier. The other thing I would say is to don't just do your job, do the next thing. So the analogy I have in a classroom is I might have an A student who does his or her work well. But the students who stick out in my mind are the students who ask what I call the next smart question. So I might teach a topic, and an A student will do what's required and get an A. But the superstar will sort of say, well, how do you apply that? Or they'll anticipate, if I'd had 15 more minutes in class, what would have been the next thing I would have talked about? Or they'll make a connection to a reading or to something in the news or to something from a different chapter that I hadn't, done myself in class, probably for time reasons. So I would just don't be satisfied to get through your to-do list. Like, just always seek out the next smart question, the next smart project. Just make your environment better by being in the environment. Sadly, I think this is going to get harder. For the last 3 to 5 years, like, it was enough to be okay and you have a job. The job market's been great. And I think going forward, it's going to be a little bit tougher. I don't mean to be negative, but I think it's going to take a little more effort for the employee, a junior employee, to stand out, to get the good job, etc.
Final question. If you were to go back to your college years and a couple years right after college, what would you tell yourself? And what advice do you wish someone had told you?
All right. Well, on a personal note, I'll be completely transparent with you. I did not go to a school with a covenant. So I probably would have had less alcohol, slept more, and made wiser choices. So that's a totally honest answer. We did not have a covenant at my undergrad. And I was a Christian, but I hadn't really made it my life. I made plenty of mistakes that I wouldn't have made. So I absolutely would have made some of those changes. And then I think the mistake I've made multiple times is I have let my job be my God many times. I have worked so hard to succeed in my career that I made that my top priority. Once I became a wife and a mom, I'm happy to say that that wasn't true after that, but I didn't always have God first. So often I would have sort of family first, then work, and then God. So I would just remind myself that God should be first at all times, in all situations, regardless of any cost that it might be, in terms of how people treat you or how much time you can commit to work, or even if you are faced with a situation where God wants you to say no, and that might cost you an opportunity at work. So put God first would be the thing that I should have done a little better sooner.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity.
You got to hear it all from Amanda Carter, and we want to thank her again for joining us on the first Royals Investment Fund podcast. I'm your host, Tony Harris, and I look forward to you joining us again next time. Thank you for listening to the Royals Investment Fund podcast.